Hello and welcome to What Makes Difference. And today we are joined by Dr. Kirby Wycoff, who is the research arm, clinical side with Dr. Dan Roberts.
Welcome and thank you very much for joining us today, Kirby.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
It's probably quite good if you give our listeners a bit of a potted history, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, absolutely. I'd be happy to introduce myself and say hello. So yes, my name is Kirby Wycoff. Please do call me Kirby. My background and training is in psychology and as a mental health provider. Also have training in public health. So a lot of my work sits at the intersection of public health, mental health, and trauma. I think a lot about adversity and stress and how that impacts kids and families and systems, and what that means for all of us, and how we have to think really carefully and deeply about what trauma can do to people and how we help alleviate suffering. My background is not necessarily in the military space, although as a result of encountering Dr. Roberts and meeting him now some years ago, I was working on a different project. It was a research project related to the experience of young Black women in the United States who had a trauma history, had some childhood adversity, and then also became pregnant, for some of them without their consent. So they experienced a sexual trauma and then became pregnant. And I started to hear a lot of stories and narratives in that research project around having to make decisions. For many of them, it was to terminate a pregnancy that violated a moral code or felt in violation of their ethics, and they felt conflict around it. And frankly, at the time, it's not something that I had seen a lot of in the literature, and I was kind of curious about it. So naturally, as a researcher, I went and did some more research and said, what is this thing I'm seeing? And in my research, I stumbled upon Dr. Dan Roberts, who was doing some really innovative, exciting stuff with this thing called moral injury. And I thought, oh my gosh, there's a name for it. That seems to be a lot like what these young women are talking about. And I reached out to Dan, and through that contact, now we have a rich partnership and research partnership. And really much of what I have learned about the military space in particular is as a result of that partnership and really Dan's expertise. So I've been really privileged to be able to work with him and learn about that, and certainly share my expertise on trauma, family systems, adversity, stress, and what those things mean for folks.
During your research, Kirby, what some of the things that you've uncovered?
In the research project?
Or discovered that that may not be well known about?
Yeah, I mean, as it relates to moral injury, I think there's so much that's not known, quite frankly, right? I mean, the literature is really pretty light. I mean, from a research standpoint, it's not something that we have a ton of knowledge about. There are a lot of unanswered questions. I will note that through the COVID experience and post-COVID experience, there actually has been more research on it, in part because there's been a much more prominent focus on the experiences of frontline healthcare workers, right? Who were very clearly, for many, in a position where they had to make difficult decisions about resources, ventilators, who got access to what resources, that did have life or death implications, right? So I am seeing an uptick in research. In fact, my research team and I just last week were working on pulling some more articles together. And just in 2022 and 23 alone, there's been a pretty significant increase in literature, not necessarily focused on moral injury in the military space, but moral injury in the healthcare space, which is helpful to us because it helps us conceptualize or really make sense of what this is. So I would start just by saying we don't know a lot about moral injury, right? It's sort of this piece of or part of or thing that seems to be related to trauma in some way, but we have a lot of unanswered questions, right? We know that it has to do with morality, maybe personal ethical code, even conscious, like things that folks have as part of their belief system, and then things that violate that. That's what we know. There's a lot that we don't know, which is why we're doing the research, of course. The focus of this particular project that Dan and I are working on, I'm sure he talked about it or at least mentioned it, is really the way that moral injury impacts, shows up in, influences family systems and partners, right? Like really, I think, not surprisingly, when some person or one person in a family system is struggling with something, it has implications for others in the system, right? Like that's classic systems thinking. We know that if one part of that whole system is not operating optimally, that it's going to have a ripple effect. So the questions we're looking at in this current study are related to how does, first of all, to be honest, does somebody who served in the military and has moral injury, do they know they have it? Do they think they have it or not have it? How do they define it? Do they think or know they have trauma? Or what we're actually learning is that in many cases, a diagnosis has been delayed for some time. For some of these folks, our conversations, it's primarily a qualitative study, or maybe the first time they're hearing about this idea of moral injury or thinking that it might even apply to them. So we're kind of exploring, like, how does this concept of moral injury even show up in a family system? And then the related questions are, how does it impact the spouse or the partner? How about children or parents? How does it impact the service member? In our case, we're talking specifically to former service persons because that allowed us some more flexibility in the questions we could ask. There's a lot of fear, at least in the United States, for military personnel to do research or to engage in these conversations for fear of retribution or fear of how that might impact their career. So we did focus specifically on former service folks, largely because we wanted them to feel like they had the freedom to be as candid as they needed to be in those conversations. Of course, the project is fully confidential, so their identity would never be known anyway, but that's just something that we built into that study as part of the work we were doing. So, to answer your question, we're looking at, and I would say it's ongoing. So we don't have like the magic answer yet. Yeah. We're hoping to get closer to it. What does moral injury look like in a family system? How do people define it? Is there something that the partner is also experiencing around morality and decision-making that's related to the service person's trauma, right? Those are some of the questions we're exploring. It is a very exploratory by design because there's so much unknown. So we are continuing to learn. We're continuing to interview people now and analyze that data so we can really sort out what is going on here and better understand it and hopefully contribute to others' understanding as well.
I'm just wondering, Kirby, if when I'm working with moral injury, if I were to describe it, because there isn't like a formal DSM-5 description of it, and I think we're a million miles away from that, and in a way, it would almost be limiting because it is so complex to give it a DSM-5 description because it's like 5 bullet points and that's it, job done. No, it's far too complex for that. Yeah. But as I'm listening, I'm thinking about the situations that I'm working with, and actually, it's almost like an emotional injury. That it's so. What I would generally see is that sense of outrage, either directed at self or at an establishment or others. There's grief, there's anger, there's betrayal, there's a sense of
injustice,
a sense of letdown, a sense of devaluing and lack of worth, a sense of well, if this is true, then what does it mean in terms of who I am? It's almost kind of that shattering of sense of identity and placement within your understanding of how the rest of the world works in relation to you. It's like everything is rocked.
Right.
And that's where it's kind of one of those things. It's like, I wouldn't want to try and describe that in 5 bullet points.
Right. How do you? Right.
It's because it's so fundamental in a way to who we are as individuals. You take all of that and you rock it and damage it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's an injury.
It's an assault on someone's core sense of self, right? Potentially, right? That's, how one sees themselves, their self-identity, their core self-concept. If that's assaulted or damaged, you can imagine how that impacts every other area of someone's life. How can it not, right? Yeah.
It's almost that point of how do you recognize yourself after that?
We've heard, and can I tell you that thing that you just asked? Who am I? Am I who I thought I was? We hear that from partners and family members as well, right? Like, I think that's a core question that people who have experienced this directly ask. And then those in their immediate family system ask that as well, right? Like, who is this person? Is this person who I thought they were? so it's both internally driven and driven by those intimate, close relationships around you, that ultimately, those are questions that I'm not surprised those are asked, but you can also understand how the fact that they are even asked is difficult, right? It's difficult to process. It's difficult to make sense of. Yeah.
How do you answer those? Sorry, Rich.
Well, as you said, it's about system, and part of that system's broken down. So it's kind of like say the plumbing you're plumbing in the house, and if there's a leak somewhere, and that leak hasn't been recognised for a long time, that's going to start the rotting, isn't it? That structure isn't going to be as stable or as good as it was initially. And until that repairs can come in, until that can get fixed. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of like the family, isn't it? With the leaky pipe, leaking all that stuff out onto others, it has to affect them in some way. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that analogy. And if you take it one step further, also having had a leaky pipe before, I think sometimes you don't know it's there right away, right? It's behind a wall, it's hidden. So there's that part of it where you're not even clear that's happening. You usually become aware it's happening. Well, in one of two ways. You start to feel a drip on your head and you go drip, drip, drip. Uh-oh, 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 uh-oh. If you don't do anything about it, to your point, right? The wood around it's going to rot or whatever it is. But at some point you may also just then see a flood, right? You literally the pipes burst. You've got gallons of water pouring out of your ceiling, whatever the case may be. And I think that's not different here as well, right? In terms of systems, right? Like if it's unaddressed and you either ignore it or you're not aware of it, right? And you don't do anything about it, at some point the whole thing might blow and it might become far more damaging than it may have been otherwise if you had addressed the initial slow drip, right? I appreciate that analogy quite a bit.
Or the other, and there's another way of looking at it is there's been repair to it, but the repair's not been good enough.
Yeah.
It's not quite there. And it's still, smaller drip is still leaking out somehow, somewhere.
Yeah. Like we put some tape on it, but you know what? It's not quite what that leak needed. And here it is. And I would say most of the folks that we're talking to in this research study and what I'm learning most about right now is after that leak has become a full-blown flood, right? Like after, years later, right? And in some cases, when a lot of damage has been done in the family system. A lot of damage has been done. Yeah.
I talk quite a lot about contracting and how important it is in all of our relationships. And the fact that a lot of those are unacknowledged. They are taken for granted. They're assumed to be there because they're values based. They're about our beliefs about how we will be treated in response to what we give or how we respond. And quite a lot of the moral injury that we end up working with, it is that dripping tap. It's almost where there's layer upon layer of broken contracts where expectations have not been met that lead to those layers of betrayal. So you come to that crucial point where the ceiling collapses, where that then becomes an injury to your sense of who you are, because that then strikes at your sense of value, your sense of worth, your sense of fairness. Is that righteousness that then kicks in, that righteous anger that this is happening. And it's almost, in a way, there's quite often it's the point of realization where the injury actually occurs. It's almost like it's building up to it, but the injury occurs at the point where you realize that, where you realize, or when you question your worth, or you question the value, or you have that thought that says, this is not fair, this is wrong, this should not have happened to me, this is an experience I shouldn't have had. I don't want to have had to have made this decision. This doesn't fit with who I am or my belief structure around who I am. And that's the point of injury. And it's the realization, which sometimes is long after the actual event, that the realization is linked to.
Right. The awareness of it. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's also what Dan was mentioning as well, wasn't it? It's not just that person. So he was chatting to a warrant officer, and she'd left. And it was a realization afterwards is, I could have done this, I could have done that to protect the women under her command. But as he said, she didn't have the power or the authority to change all that sort of stuff. So she's left with that dilemma as well.
Right. Right. In some ways, you think about the point of realization when something comes into your conscious awareness, that's when it has the damaging effect, right? Or at least that you're aware of. I mean, in many cases, I would think that it's actually our brain and conscious's own way of protecting itself, right? Like, because if you become aware of that when you're not able to process it, or while you're still in that situation, thinking of the example Dan provided, then the whole thing can fall apart, right? Like in some ways, like the lack of awareness or recognition of the injury, in some ways may be some unconscious self-protection, right? Your brain's way of saying like, we cannot fathom that right now, so we're going to keep it way back here. Our body is probably impacted by it, right? But our conscious awareness is not until a later time when we're maybe better equipped or better able to process it. So it's definitely something. I mean, when I think of the folks that we're speaking to, many of them, when they're telling their stories, are going years and years back, right? To talk about their experience with their partner, or in some cases, quite frankly, their former partner, because they're no longer in a relationship with that person because of the damage that was caused in their interpersonal, whether they were married or not, or just in an interpersonal relationship, right? It's retrospective. They're reporting back on things that happened years and years ago, but continue to have impact now and into the future. Yeah.
So that'd be then breaking that intergenerational trauma, isn't it? Stopping it at some point, going, we know we've got a problem here. How do we stop that from going forward?
Yeah. The intergenerational piece is really striking to me. It's something I've long been interested in, primarily because my career started working in schools with kids. And I remember having a realization early on in my career, like, these little people come with big people, right? Like, obviously we know that they come from somewhere, but like, it's not just this young person that's my patient or my client, but also the person that brought them to me, right? Because all those other layers of their life. And we are hearing a lot in this research about the intergenerational impacts. And interestingly, what we're hearing is a lot of shame and guilt around actions not taken to protect their children in light of having a partner, spouse who has trauma and or moral injury, and in many cases it's untreated, and there's some really negative, dangerous, in some cases, parenting practices that are happening, or just dangerous, emotionally unsafe homes. And a lot of the partners that we're talking to talk about some guilt and shame that they have for not protecting their children, not doing it, not making choices sooner. And yeah, you see literally how that trauma goes from this generation to the next when you hear, a lot of them are also reporting out on some of the struggles that their children are having. And, some with really strikingly damaging impact on, the younger generation, those children of the service person and spouse who are struggling with trauma and in some cases moral injury.
So if you work on the principle that actually it's not the size of the event, it's the size of the impact that indicates the scope of the injury, and we look at the intergenerational piece, there's also that potential where actually the next generation suffers the injury on behalf of the previous one, because that's the point of realization that this was wrong. That this is in conflict with what was right and what should have happened. So it's almost like the delay can be beyond almost the lifespan of the experiencing generation and into the next.
I mean, boy, yeah. I mean, I find that my sense of trauma broadly is that is a possibility, right? Not necessarily moral injury alone, although I think it can happen there, but I think I see that with trauma in general. I would say it seems to me that there's some relationship, and I don't know what yet, and I don't know that we as a field fully understand this, but I would say that there seems to be some relationship between the extent to which a person is able to process and engage in healing and repair, that then likely influences the degree to which a future generation, a child, a grandchild might experience distress related to that trauma. Does that make sense? I'm not sure if I'm being entirely clear about that, but right,
could that be because that child is modeling that adult's behavior?
I would think, I mean, how could it not, right? Yeah. Because if I see my parent who maybe has had a significant trauma or experienced moral injury, is a former service person, and I see and experience them healing, then I'm being modeled something different than if I don't see that healing. I would also say, like, in addition to like observing that, then one of the things that I am hearing more and more of, which I probably knew was going to be the case, but don't think you really appreciate it until you hear it out of the mouths of people experiencing it, is the ways in which trauma and moral injury influence parenting, and the ways folks parent, the styles of parenting, the ways that they interact with their children. It's striking. It is, I'm thinking of one of our participant families where the spouse described the experiences of her adolescent daughter, who had an interaction or a situation unfold with the daughter's dad. So the dad was the former service person who had trauma and moral injury and was largely untreated and undiagnosed. And listening to mom talk about how dad's way of interacting with teenage daughter, and the ways that was damaging the teenage daughter, including one specific event where the teenager was in the car and dad came out to try to prevent her from driving somewhere, but was very violent about it, was dangerous, quite frankly, in how he was interacting with his own daughter. You hear about just, and as you're listening, you can hear how his trauma is influencing the ways he's interacting with his teenage daughter. But then you also hear there's no way that that's not going to impact this adolescent, right? I mean, literally, her sense of self is unfolding right now in adolescence, and the messaging that she's getting and the ways that she's seeing this person interact with her make her feel very, very unsafe, right? So when you hear these stories about how unsafe, and actually that specific incident was one that led to that mom then saying, she'd kind of got to a tipping point with the shame and guilt and said, like, I have to take action to protect my child. As committed as I am to my partner, the former service person, and as committed as I am to the military and my sense of patriotism and in some cases my spirituality, because I took an oath to be this person's wife, I have to do something to protect my child, because situations like that are so unsafe, right? Heightened her awareness of, like, this cannot continue. But so that, to me, that intergenerational piece is really, really interesting and also compelling. I think we need to know more about it, quite frankly. I don't
know how it can influence. It has,
right? Yeah.
Because if you think about it, when we are children into our teenage years, we are still modeling the values and the beliefs and the world assumptions that we see and witness in our parents. Yeah. And we start, and those formative years are when we're almost questioning and shaping those. But if our experiences are boundaried with that in such a way that they don't allow us that exploration, they don't allow us the confidence and the safety to explore and find out and shape our own views, then all that's left are the views that we witness from others.
Right.
And if that's tainted or coloured by that righteous anger, that injury, then that's what we model.
Yeah. Go ahead.
A bit less of the extreme what you're going about, Kirby, is I know of the serviceman or the servicewoman, and they treat their child like they're in a recruit, like they're serving soldiers. So they get them to do room inspections, stand by your bed in the morning, check your bed's cleaned, are your boots tidy, and all that. To a certain extent, all that discipline is pretty good, but some people do take that to the extreme end of things.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't quite thought about it that way. And you think if that's how that parent has been socialized, if they spent so much time in the military that is their way of thinking about the world, which I think is often the case, right? That regiment sort of
indoctrination.
Yes, thank you. That's a great word, right? Like, how is that not going to show up in your parenting practices? Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
I recall one guy who, so I was told that he was showing his 5-7-year-old child armored fighting vehicles, and back in the day, it used to be recognizing, if you went into the anti-tanks, you'd recognize them by the heat signatures or the Russian fighting equipment. And his 5 or 7-year-old child was able to recognize what BMP was, what T-62 was, T-72 was, etc., by the heat signatures.
Wow. Yeah. That's pretty striking, right? I mean, think about that. And you think about like a 7 or 8-year-old knowing that, right? Yeah. I mean, then you layer on top of that, right, a significant assault or violation of one's own. You think of that service person, and it's one thing if they've been indoctrinated by their time in the military and have no trauma or no moral injury. That's going to probably show up in their parenting just by virtue of being in the military for so long. Then you add on the layer of the trauma or the moral injury, largely unresolved, largely untreated. The number of delayed diagnoses is gobsmacking to me, right? Then how is that influence on the next generation not going to be even more exponentially impactful, right? I mean, one of the things that I think frustrates me, but is the reality, right? As a researcher, I sort of, we allow ourselves to have an emotional experience, and then I sort of bracket it, right? I say, okay, I'm having an emotional reaction to what I've learned from this person as I read that transcript of the interview, as I listen to it. Okay, Kirby, researcher, you can have your emotional reaction. And then I put that in a box and I sort of hold it here so I can actually analyze the data, right? But in this conversation, I'll talk about some of the emotional reaction I have because I think it's important to acknowledge. The number of folks that we've spoken to whose diagnosis has been delayed or never happened as a function of being involved in a system that historically has devalued mental health and treatment is gobsmackingly striking and infuriating, quite frankly. I mean, my early career is working with youth, right? Everything we know about mental health education in young people is that early intervention works. The earlier we identify it, the earlier we intervene, the more likely we are to change that trajectory, right? Like, that is so well documented in the literature. We know it's there. Yet almost every single story that has shown up in this research thus far has involved, in many cases, an intentional delayed diagnosing, even to the extent which there's clear dialogue about it with mental health professionals. Oh yeah, no, we know it's there, but we're not going to write it down. We're not going to put it anywhere. We're not going to give you access to treatment because of X, Y, and Z. I mean, that to me is part of where the larger system, right? We've talked a lot about family systems, but the larger system of the military, the larger system of even how our country, perhaps yours as well, views the military and mental health, there's a responsibility there that has to be addressed, and as far as I can tell, has not yet fully been addressed.
That'd be probably not wanting to pay compensation for the extra damage they've caused.
Right? Yeah.
I think the important part there is the extra damage they've caused, Rich, because it's bad enough that there's a delay in diagnosis and support for things like trauma recovery for PTS, for CPTS. But if you layer on the delays and the frustration without getting the correct treatment, then what you've got is you've got a scenario where you're literally have moral injury waiting to happen. And at that point, then that person runs the risk of being diagnosed or identified as just being awkward, being difficult, being problematic.
Difficult and problematic, right?
Not engaging, not helping themselves. And then what does that do in terms of the moral injury that's now being suffered? That magnifies that further.
Well, there's sanctuary trauma added into that as well.
It is. Yeah.
And I wonder, Kirby, is there a relationship as well between, say, somebody being that delay in diagnosis and possibly a misdiagnosis as well. So they've come in to see clinical psychologists, whomever, and they said, right, X, Y, and Z, it's anxiety, but actually it's complex post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress, but they've just diagnosed it as anxiety or depression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that happens. I think that the misunderstanding, like, look, as a mental health provider, our job is to first assess, right? We have to do a thorough, robust assessment, collect data, and then build a case conceptualization, right? Build an understanding of this individual, right? So they come in, they tell us what's going on. Our job is to peel back the layers of the onion and try to sort out what is going on, right? Identify it and name it, and then build we call it a conceptualization, an understanding of why this person's struggling and what they're struggling with. That literally is supposed to drive your treatment, right? You should not pick a treatment until you understand what's going on, because otherwise you're treating the wrong thing, right? I think that the place I see the case conceptualization and the diagnosis sort of falling apart is, I think there's a lack of understanding of what moral injury is. So I think, I think many psychologists, for example, if somebody with a military background were to come into their office and describe some of the things that we've been talking about, they might think anxiety, they might think depression, but I think they will get to the place where they recognize that trauma is probably involved, if only because we've been socialized in our educational system here, at least, to associate military with PTSD, right? So I think that happens. I think that there's also some recognition that anxiety and depression might be part of that clinical picture. What I think is missed, largely because we don't know enough about it, is the moral injury part, right? Or if that's there. I think also what's often missed is early trauma, right? I don't think that's often assessed for very often. I think they're assessing for it in the way that the DSM presents it, right? Like, are these things present? Yes or no? Then you have this. For me, I think the pieces that are missed around moral injury and ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, that I think then can lead to choices for treatment that perhaps don't quite align well enough with what's going on, that someone might continue to experience symptoms. But yeah, I think that's what I have seen and what I would expect to see, at least here.
I think it's also that when you're working on the assumption that this is purely post-traumatic stress or complex post-traumatic stress, and not considering that emotional injury to sense of self, to sense of identity, then no matter what you do to treat that, if that's not healed too, you're leaving an open wound.
Right.
And actually, it's almost like you've got to treat it in layers.
Yeah.
Because if you don't resolve the issue in that sense of identity, that sense of value, that sense of worth, then you're almost leaving the door open for resurgences of those experiences, because in a way, those symptoms are the dialogue that we're having with ourselves that says something still needs to change.
Yeah. I mean, and to me, that's missed very often. The other part of that aligns with what you just said is the spirituality part or the morality part, right? Like, if you use a standard evidence-based intervention for PTSD, military related, you likely are not also addressing the morality, spirituality, violation of conscious. You're missing that part, right? And like anything else you treat, if you don't fully understand it and you don't treat it the way you're like you said, you're leaving something unhealed and unaddressed, which will inevitably come back. How can it not? If something's not healed and it continues to be a problem or cause someone distress, I don't think we should be surprised if that person comes back and says, "Hey, I'm still struggling. Like, what the heck?" Right? Like, I thought we did this treatment, it was going to make things better, but it hasn't. Well, yeah, because if you've missed something, then, and that's not a knock on psychologists or mental health professionals. I think it's just the reality of what we know and don't know about these kinds of things, and the work that's still yet to be done to build understanding. This is where I will say again, for all the challenges and trauma that COVID caused, one thing that positively has come out of it is there's a greater dialogue across, I would say, hopefully the globe, right, broadly around trauma, and even awareness of moral injury, because there's not a single person I can think of that wasn't impacted by COVID in some way. So it gives us shared language to say like, oh yeah, if you were a healthcare provider and you had 1 ventilators and 2 people dying, you're going to have made a decision about who gets to live and who gets to die. People can get that because they saw COVID or experienced COVID. That has helped us, I think, in the sense that now we can say, oh yeah, no, that's the thing that we've been saying for a while that military service persons has been experiencing. Like, oh, okay, more research funding, more researchers looking at it, more clinicians aware of it, right? So that to me is a glimmer of hope, because it's only when we fully understand something that we can actually seek to address it, at least in my experience.
Well, as you mentioned, the medical field, they're now calling burnout, aren't they, moral injury?
Yeah, I literally, when my team and I were looking at some of those articles, we just talked about, we actually met, what's today? Thursday. We met on Tuesday night and talked about that. Yeah, there is conversation in the literature around, well, is it actually that? Is this something different? There's rich dialogue. I don't think there are answers yet. I'm not quite convinced that they're the same. I think we need to know more. I think there's something distinctly different about moral injury, but I'm not sure that we know quite yet, quite frankly.
Well, that could also be, is then people get that compassion fatigue involved as well. With
right.
The whole of things, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
But in a way, that compassion fatigue is almost an injury waiting to happen, because if that changes and that compassion rebounds, then you almost have the potential for the injury for the intervening timescale when that's maybe not been as present. And it's almost kind of like, it's that point of realization again, isn't it? Over what happened in the intervening timescale. What decisions did I have to make given the situation I was in and where I am now? Even though that's different and the situation's different, it's almost like I'm bringing those decisions now and applying them to the situation now and going, this doesn't fit with who I thought I was. It was almost like a separation from event in the timeline, and it almost brings it forward to the point of realization and applies the current situation and the injury to sense of who you are occurs.
Yeah, I mean, it also makes me wonder about, if some of those earlier things are not the vulnerabilities and the risk factors, right? And if left unaddressed and not acknowledged or treated or have healing around, you're just, perfect storm, right? Like that, then you get closer and closer to the potential event, and that's a risk factor for, or increases the likelihood that you might experience this. Again, I think there's a lot we don't know.
Well, that's where it comes. The research indicates that there is a higher prevalence of PTS and CPTS if there is a background that has an indication for ACEs in individuals. And I'm saying that it indicates a higher prevalence because it's not categoric that there's a definitive link between the two. And I wouldn't want to put that out there to say one predetermines the other, because I don't think that's right. We don't have the facts and the research to back that up.
Right. But
there is definitely layers within there which increase the vulnerability level.
Yeah, and I think we see that in the military population. We see it in other populations, right? Like the literature is clear that increased adversity during childhood, when our brain is still developing and our sense of self is still developing, increases likelihood of other things, right? There's a whole host, physical and emotional, right? We know that, Feliti Nanda did a good job in that original ACEs study. And I would wager a guess that shows up here as well, right? Like if we were to retroact, and actually some, not all, but some of the folks that we are speaking to did also report early childhood trauma and early stress. In fact, I actually think that some of them sought out military service.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There's some relationship, and they talk about that, right? Like, why did because it gave me structure, it gave me stability, it gave me something that I was missing. And I think there's a relationship there. Again, do we know that it's causal? No. But is there something there? Likely, very likely. Yeah.
Kirby, can you give us a couple of key takeaways from your study of moral injury?
Yeah, I mean, right. Like if I had to boil them down, and I will remind you and our viewers that it's in progress, so we're still learning. But I think the big ones for me that are really jumping out so far are, to be thinking about the relationships in the family system, right? There is something really significant is happening there. And if you're somebody that's working with service members or former service members who have trauma or have some type of moral injury, be asking about and exploring family relationships and family systems, because they are there and something is happening there. I think thinking about early identification and destigmatizing so that we can accurately assess and diagnose people earlier so that they get what they need has to be part of our way of thinking about this. Those to me are the big ones that stand out. The spouses are saying, don't forget about us because this impacts me too. And there's not enough support for the rest of the family members, let alone the service person. So I think those are the big ones that are jumping out to me right now with where we're at in the research.
Thank you for your time, Kirby. We really do appreciate you coming on and having a chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both for, an animated and interesting dialogue. I think we had said this perhaps earlier, but this is something that probably all of us could talk about for quite some time, more time than we have for podcasts. But I'm happy to come back and visit with you all as we learn more and share what we're learning. And I appreciate the opportunity to chat today.
Yeah, well, hopefully we get to see you live.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, Kirby.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Until next time.
Until next time.